Hey everyone, this is Mike and welcome back to the last episode of What Job Should You Play in Final Fantasy XIV. Today we're going to be taking a look at the casters, aka the ranged magical DPS. Now just like the ranged, these can be anywhere on the field to deal their damage, but they are a lot more restricted when it comes down to their movement because they do have casting times on most of their abilities. Now of course, each of these three jobs has their own way to handle movement, and all of these three jobs can do any fight in the game and still play and pull out quite a bit of DPS as well, because since they are more restricted to their movement abilities, in general they are going to be bringing a little bit more DPS if you were to compare it to, let's say, the ranged physicals, because they do have that freedom of movement. So being able to optimize the movement around these three jobs is going to be very important if you want to maximize the damage that you do, because even though all three of them have spammable options when it comes down to moving about, so you can technically always keep your GCD rolling if you have to move, but some options that they have baked into their kit are going to be a lot better and DPS neutral, or even a DPS gain in certain cases, rather than just constantly spamming that movement ability that will actually end up being a DPS loss. But we'll talk about all of these things when we get there. Now, when it comes down to comparing these three jobs in a raiding scenario, how does it work with raid buffing or some supporting actions or that kind of stuff? It kind of flows the same as the ranged physical DPS. So we have Red Mage, who is very much a ranged or like a raid supporter. We have Summoner, who is kind of a medium in between Red Mage and Black Mage, and then we have Black Mage, who is just a full-on selfish DPS and only takes and doesn't give. So that's kind of how you can compare it like that. Now the reason being is because Red Mage is very much so much so a support, so it doesn't have a whole lot of DPS. Well, it does have a pretty decent amount of DPS, of course, because it is still a viable job. I played it during week 1 Savage raiding and it was totally fine. So don't worry about it doing not enough damage. It does enough damage. But when you compare it to the other two, it does significantly less. So we have Red Mage, lowest DPS, Summoner in between, but still very close to Black Mage, and then Black Mage on the top. So that's kind of how these three balance out, and that is because of how much raid contribution and support that they offer the raid. So when it comes down to Red Mage, it has a raid buff that is available every 2 minutes, but the problem being with it is that it's only a physical damage buff, meaning that it doesn't really play nice in a multiple casting scenario. So for example, especially this tier, a lot more groups are experimenting with a double caster setup, which is actually a really good team composition, especially in Shadowbringers. But Red Mage doesn't really fit in that composition that well, because their damage buff only applies to physical damage dealers. So if you put it into a scenario with like 2 melees and a ranged, it's going to be fairly good, but if you put it in a double caster scenario, then it's not really going to be all that great. Now, outside of just this raid buff, they also have a resurrection available, and because of how their dual casting nature work, which dual cast is a passive that Red Mage has, which I'll talk about more when we talk about Red Mage itself, it means that Red Mage can pull off a lot of revives in very quick succession. You can just like rest someone, dual cast into another rest, and then swift cast another one or something like that, and you can rest 3 people in the span of a couple of seconds, whereas something like a summoner needs to hold their swift cast in order to rest, because summoner can also still res a person, but they can only either swift cast it or hard cast the rest, which will take very long, whereas Red Mage can literally just chain rest people in a matter of seconds because of the dual casting nature of the job. So that's really cool about that. Now when we move over to Summoner, as I just mentioned, they still have a resurrection available to them, but it is kind of tied behind that swift cast if you want to get someone up fast, and just hard casting the rest will be a pretty big damage loss for you yourself. And they still also have a raid buff as well in that of Devotion, but this one is on a 3-minute cooldown instead of a 2-minute one, and it just buffs everyone, so it kind of makes up for that fact as well. And then we have Black Mage, who has no raid synergy at all. It just takes a lot of damage, but on the other hand, it puts out a lot of damage as well and still makes it pretty good because of that fact. So let's now get into detail of each and every one of these casters. We'll start with Red Mage and then work our way all the way towards Black Mage. So first of all, with Red Mage, the big kind of identity that it has is that it is a fencer, but still a mage as well, and also the dual casting passive. So when it comes down to it being a fencer, the way how the rotation flows is you're going to be using your normal spells to build up your gauge. You have a gauge which is called a mana gauge, and you have both a black and a white gauge on there. Now you try to balance this gauge as you get it all the way up to 80, which once you reach 80 on both of your manas you can get in close and do a fully enhanced melee combo. Now you do still want to create a slight imbalance because reasons, which I'll talk about in just a second, but that's kind of what you want to be doing. So you want to be using your normal spells to fill your mana gauge, trying to keep it balanced as you bring it up to 80-80 or to above 80 on both of the gauges. And then you can get in close, do a fully enhanced melee combo, and then you also get access to your 2 combo finishers. If you don't do a fully enhanced melee combo, so for example, say you didn't have enough gauge and your last attack in your combo isn't enhanced, then you also don't get access to those 2 combo finishers. So you do really want to make sure you have enough mana to execute a full combo. Now, outside of this, we also have the dual casting passive, I guess we'll call it. So every time that Red Mage casts a spell, they proc dual cast, and this will make it so that the next skill that you used will become an instant cast. So basically, every skill that they cast, they get a swift cast. And this makes it so that Red Mage is going to be very maneuverable, makes it so that they have easy access to off-global cooldowns as well, and this is especially what it makes it so easy for them to chain res people, because of course Resurrection is like an 8-second cast or a 10-second cast, something like that, maybe even longer, I'm not quite sure, but basically it takes a long time to res someone. But because Red Mage has that dual cast, what they can do is they can cast a fast spell, res, cast a fast spell, res, cast a fast spell, res. So they can basically res a lot of people really quickly as long as they have the mana to do so. So it's really good when it comes down to raid progression or getting like learning a raid, because they can just keep resing people, and that is something that the other casters don't have. Black Mage just simply can't res at all, and Summoner can only really res one person if they save their swift cast for it. So that's where Red Mage is incredibly strong. Now, of course, this dual casting also ties into their rotation. They have a couple of spells that are really fast to cast, and they also have a couple of spells that are really slow to cast. So basically, you use the fast skill to proc dual cast, and then you spend the passive on a slow skill, and that's kind of how their general GCD rotation flows as well. So you have Jolt, which is your basic I have no procs skill to proc the dual cast. You have Arrow and Thunder, which are your slow casts, which you will spend the dual cast on. And then you have Fire and Stone, which are procced from Arrow and Thunder. So whenever you use Thunder, there is a 50% chance to proc Fire, and whenever you cast Arrow, there is a 50% chance to proc Stone. And then Stone and Fire will serve as the replacement of your Jolt. So if you don't get a proc, you use Jolt. If you do get a proc, you use the Fire or the Thunder depending on which one procced, and then you go back to casting Arrow and Thunder. I know the explanation might be a little bit complex as to like, oh shit, there's a bunch of different names and that kind of stuff, but in practice it's a very simple mechanic, and in my opinion Red Mage is also definitely the easiest caster to pick up. Might not necessarily be the easiest to execute because there's a lot of optimization that goes into Red Mage when it comes down to managing your gauge and procs and all of that stuff, and kind of trying to align your burst with the raid's burst, because there is a lot of RNG involved to your gauge building, so there is some cool optimization that you can do at endgame. But when it comes down to learning Red Mage, picking it up as a first caster is definitely the easiest one to pick up and play from the get-go compared to the other two casters, because Red Mage is very maneuverable. Like every other cast, they can move. They have a lot of off-global cooldowns, and they have a lot of cool mechanics baked into their kit as well, and it is still a very simple rotation to do it at a basic level of play. So that's why Red Mage is pretty cool. Now, the one drawback of Red Mage is that it doesn't have a lot of continuous movement available to itself. And of course, this is usually not a problem because not many fights require you to have continuous movement available, but some fights or some parts of the fight might require this. For example, Dragon Song, what's it called again? Iceland Dragon Song from E8 Savage is a very good example of that. If I'm playing Summoner or a Black Mage, I have a lot of an easier time to deal with the mechanic without losing damage than on a Red Mage, because with Red Mage, yes, you have that dual cast, but if you don't get the time to cast one skill, then you kind of can't get that dual cast proc, and then you're kind of stuck there. So you can still use a skill called Reprise, which is basically your instant cast skill, but if you use it more than like once or twice every 2 minutes, it's going to start to become a huge damage loss, and you don't want to just spam that skill for movement. So optimizing movement can still be a little bit tricky on Red Mage as well, even though you might say it has a lot of movement baked into its kit because of the dual casting nature. Some parts of certain fights can still be a little bit tricky. Then moving on to Summoner, in my opinion probably the most complex one to learn, but once you learn all of its rotations and its intricacies, it's actually fairly alright to execute upon it. So the main reason why Summoner is so complex is because it has a lot of little tricks that you need to know in order to make all of the mechanics of Summoner work. Summoner has some clunk into its job because it's a pet job, and the pets don't always act like you would like them to when it comes down to them out executing actions or them executing auto attacks and that kind of stuff. And thus you need to learn certain ways in order to get the most efficient use out of these pets so that they do all of their auto attacks, or so that you make sure that they use their skills before like they go away and ghost the skill or something like that. Ghosting a skill is when you press the skill, it goes on cooldown, but it doesn't happen, so you don't get the effects or you don't get the damage from it and that kind of stuff. And when you ghost a lot of skills over the course of a fight, you're of course going to be losing a lot of damage compared to someone that does know how to work around this mechanic and then does not ghost any actions and still get all of the benefits from them, of course. So that's pretty important to learn when it comes to optimizing Summoner at endgame. Of course, as you're learning it, I wouldn't pay too much attention to it, but at endgame there are a couple of mechanics that you need to learn in this job to make sure that you don't lose too much damage from actions being ghosted or just like completely vanishing and that kind of stuff. So that's pretty important to know about Summoner. Now, the way it works is really cool actually. Summoner in Shadowbringers has become an actual summoner. Your pet is a very important part of your rotation, and using your pet correctly will also actually see you gain a lot of damage than if you were to use it incorrectly. So when it comes down to Summoner, they have a couple of normal skills, which we'll talk about first, and then we'll talk about the pet skills as well as your summons and your trances, because Summoner has so much available to it. If you look at Red Mage, it was literally just, you have your 5 GCDs, which is your normal rotation, and then you have like your melee burst damage and that's it. With Summoner, you have spammable skills, you have your dots, you have your energy drain, you have your pets, you have your trances, and you have your summons. So there's a lot of stuff going on with Summoner that you need to learn, but once you learn it, it is a pretty simple flow to follow along with. So when we look at the normal skills, we have our 2 damage over time skills, Bio and Miasma. These can also be applied through an off-global cooldown called Try Disaster. So in general, we're going to try to use Try Disaster as much as possible to apply our dots, and then we hardcast our dots when we don't have Try Disaster available to us. This will be once every 2 minutes, which 2 minutes is the rotation cycle for Summoner as well. Then we have 3 spammable skills, which will be our filler GCDs. We have Ruin 2, Ruin 3, and Ruin 4. Ruin 2 is an instant cast ability that does not do a lot of damage, but if you need it for movement or weaving, then you can do that. Ruin 4 is the upgraded version of Ruin 2 that you get access to every time that you use a pet action called Eggy Assault. So basically, you want to try to use your Eggy Assaults for movement and weaving, and then when you need extra movement and weaving, you can use those Ruin 4s instead. And then we also have Ruin 3, which is your standard casted like filler GCD. Basically, when you don't have anything to do and you can stand still, you use your Ruin 3 as much as possible. Now, when it comes down to your pet actions, we have Eggy Assault 1 and 2, as well as Devotion, because your raid buff Devotion also comes from your pet. Now, when it comes down to Eggy Assault 1 and 2, these are instant cast abilities and will order your pet to do a certain attack, so you do need to give your pet enough time to execute these attacks before you, for example, summon your demi-summon Bahamut or Phoenix. Now, whenever you use an Eggy Assault, and your pet actually executes the action as well, you're granted a stack of Ruination. This can stack up to 4 times, and will grant you access to that Ruin 4 attack that I said before. So, when it comes down to optimizing movement and off-global cooldown weaving and that kind of stuff, you want to try to always use either your Eggy Assaults for weaving and movement, or your Ruin 4s to do that, because there are a lot of, like, this basically gives you already a lot of movement and a lot of off-global cooldown usages through those pet actions and the Ruin 4s, that it basically becomes all the, like, optimizing Summoner, a big part of that becomes trying to minimize the usage of Ruin 2, and I think that's a really cool concept. So those are kind of like your normal GCDs. You have your Ruin skills, you have your dots, and you have your pet actions. Now, when we take a look at our summons, they kind of tie in together with our trances. We have Dreadworm Trance, which is the one that unlocks Bahamut for you, but when you go into Dreadworm Trance, you have to exit it before you can summon Bahamut. So summoning Bahamut and the trance don't like go together. Whereas your Firebird trance and the Phoenix summon, they do happen together. So when it comes down to summoning Bahamut, you have to go into Dreadworm trance, exit the trance, then summon Bahamut. And when you go into Firebird trance, that automatically summons your Phoenix as well, and it transforms your normal GCDs into Phoenix GCDs as well, like Phoenix attack commands, that kind of stuff. So when it comes down to summoning these two different primals, it is still going to feel different as well, because your Dreadworm trance is very simple, a trance that just gives you instant actions, or well, basically it gives you 2.5 second cost reduction, so anything that is not a resurrection will be an instant cost during this trance. And then you get access to your Bahamut once you exit, and then during your Bahamut, you still gotta try to kind of manipulate your GCDs and pull Ruin Force stacks towards that Bahamut so that you don't lose too much damage or auto attacks from your Bahamut, of course. And then your Phoenix itself will feel different from your Bahamut summon because you're going to be executing Phoenix actions rather than your normal GCDs and that kind of stuff. So that's why I think it's a pretty cool different system right there. So that's kind of the flow of Summoner. You have your normal filler skills with your pet actions, you have your Dreadworm trance, and then your Bahamut summon after that. Once your Bahamut is done, your Dreadworm trance transforms into the Firebird trance, which you can then use to summon your Phoenix. And then once your Phoenix is done, you go back into your kind of normal spammable filler rotation, where you use those Ruin skills, keep your dot up, and use your pet actions and that kind of stuff. And then it repeats itself again by going into your Dreadworm transform Bahamut. And then last but not least, we have the Black Mage, the selfish caster, the one that does not provide raid buffs, but on the other hand, provides a whole lot of personal DPS. Now when it comes down to comparing its DPS against Summoner, Summoner is incredibly close to Black Mage when it comes down to dealing damage, and it still has that resurrection available and that kind of stuff, but Black Mage still does a little bit more damage than a Summoner, but it is also a little bit more difficult to play in how you do the movement. So Black Mage's rotation itself is fairly simple. You basically switch in between two buffs called Astral Fire and Umbral Eyes, and basically depending on which buff you are in, you're going to be doing something different to your rotation. Now, the rotation itself is fairly easy, but when it comes down to moving about as a Black Mage, it's a little bit harder, because Red Mage, as I said, dual casting, you have a lot of movement available to you. Summoner, your trances are instant cost, both of them, both Dreadworm and Fireburst, and then your Aggie Assaults are instant, and your Ruin Force are instant too, and if need be, you still have your Ruin too, so Summoner has a shitload of movement baked into its kit, even without losing any damage for it. But then when it comes to Black Mage, they're a lot more limited to its movement, and it's a much more stationary caster than the other two. To kind of make up for that, if you are able to get your movement throughout your normal skills like your triple cast, your Xenoglossies, your procs, then you are going to be rewarded by a lot of DPS. So optimizing Black Mage's DPS is not necessarily going to be about executing its rotation perfectly, because the rotation is fairly simple, although there is some really galaxy brain shit that you can do, which I am definitely not good enough for. But when it comes down to trying to optimize its damage, for me mainly it's about trying to limit the movement that you have to do, or optimizing the movement that you are doing, which I think is a really cool concept. So let's talk about its normal rotation. We have these two buffs that I just talked about, Fire and Ice. When you go into your Ice phase, this is basically your mana regenerating phase. During this, you're not going to be dealing a lot of damage, but your mana is going to regen like crazy, as in you're going to go from 0 mana to full in literally the span of a few seconds. Now, when you transform into your Fire phase, this is where you're going to be dealing a lot of damage, but on the other hand, you're not going to be regenerating any mana either. So it's kind of a balancing act between these two gauges, or these two buffs. Go into Fire to deal a lot of damage, finish the Fire phase to go back into Ice, and then in Ice phase you gain all of your mana back to basically go back into Fire and do a lot of damage again. You don't have a crazy amount of GCDs available to you to do all of these kind of things, it's mainly just spamming the same buttons over and over again, but optimizing where you want to use all of these things and when you switch into which stance. For example, you want to try and be in Fire as much as possible under raid buffs and that kind of stuff. And then of course you also have a damage over time skill, Thunder, that you want to reapply as well, and then you also need to make sure that you don't run out of your buff timer, because both Fire and Ice have a timer on them that needs to be refreshed, and if you don't refresh it, you lose your buff, and dropping the buff is really bad because you have a buff called Enochian, and this will allow you to cast Fire 4 and Blizzard 4, which are your stronger skills that you need available for your rotation, and it also allows you to cast Xenoglossy, which is something that you get access to once every 30 seconds of being in Enochian. So you do really need to make sure that you stay in Enochian as much as possible. So you really need to make sure you never drop these stances, basically. So it is really cool that you can kind of like move through these different stances. It feels very fluent. Of course, you still have all of that movement that needs to come in Black Mage as well. So you have some movement skills. For example, when you proc a skill, either being Fire 3 or Thunder 4, then those become an instant cast ability when you use them. And then you also still have your triple cast, which is something that will allow you to cast the next 3 skills as instant cast. And then you also still have your Xenoglossy, which is an instant cast ability that you get once every 30 seconds, and it also stacks up to 2 times, so you can kind of pool some resources to certain parts of a fight if you do need all of that movement on Black Mage, which is really cool. As I said, certain jobs require a little bit more fight knowledge to be able to maneuver around them quite well. Black Mage is pretty much the prime job when it comes to those, if we look at the 3 different casters. So on its concept, on its basic rotation, it is a really simple, straightforward job to play. Go into fire to deal damage, run out of mana, go into ice, regen that mana, go back into fire, deal damage again. So really simple in that aspect, but when it comes down to maneuvering around the map, it does become a little bit tricky on certain fights that require a lot of movement, because you need to be able to use all of your movement skills pretty well in order to not lose too much damage because of all of that. So those are the 3 different casters that are available in Final Fantasy XIV. That's kind of how their playstyle goes and how they handle with movement as well. I hope you enjoyed it. This is going to be the last episode of this little mini-series as well, because we now finished all of the jobs. Maybe I'll do something else like this in the future when, for example, we go into the next expansion or something like that. But we'll have to wait and see for that. For now, if you have any more questions about the jobs, feel free to ask them in the comments or on my Discord channel, of course. I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.